She was told her voice meant nothing, until the entire palace learned how wrong they were. In the grand hall of Moonfall Palace, where crystal chandeliers cast pale silver light over rows of gathered alphas and noble-born omegas, Emily Carter stood at the very edge of existence, unseen and unwanted like a shadow pressed against marble walls. The night was meant to celebrate the ancient Luna rite, a sacred tradition where the Alpha King would observe and select the one destined to stand beside him. Yet for Emily, it felt like standing inside a world that had already decided she did not belong to it. Whispers moved through the crowd like cold wind, soft enough to avoid consequence, but sharp enough to cut those who heard them. And her name was never spoken with respect, only with that familiar tone of dismissal reserved for those deemed insignificant. No mate, no presence, no purpose, someone muttered nearby, not even bothering to lower their voice. Emily kept her gaze lowered, hands gently folded, as if stillness could make her invisible enough to survive the night. At the center of the hall, King Adrian Blackthorne observed everything from his elevated throne, his posture calm, unreadable, carved from the discipline of a ruler who had learned to see without reacting. His presence alone quieted portions of the room, yet even he had not acknowledged her, not even once, as if she were nothing more than part of the decor. Then it happened. A group of elegantly dressed omegas near the central aisle turned their attention toward her, exchanging subtle smiles that carried intention rather than kindness. One of them, a woman with a polished voice and effortless confidence, tilted her head and called out softly, "If you're truly here, then sing for us. The Luna hymn. Surely even someone like you can manage that much." The words were followed by light laughter, delicate and controlled, the kind that pretends to be harmless while ensuring the wound still lands. The suggestion spread quickly, rippling through nearby guests until it became something resembling consensus, a performance requested not out of respect, but out of entertainment. Emily felt every eye shift toward her, pressure building in the silence that followed, and she understood with painful clarity that refusal would only deepen the humiliation. Slowly, she stepped forward. Each movement felt heavier than the last, as though the polished floor itself resisted her presence. The hall did not stop her, it simply watched. Even now, King Adrian did not intervene. He only observed, his expression unchanged, though something in the stillness around him began to subtly tighten, as if the air itself sensed an approaching shift. Emily reached the center of the hall, beneath the towering chandelier where light poured down like judgment, and for a brief moment she hesitated, her breath catching as she looked at the vast audience that had already decided her worth. Then, as if answering something deeper than fear, she parted her lips and began to sing the first fragile note of the Luna hymn, unaware that the sound about to leave her would not just fill the hall, but begin to change it. The first note left Emily Carter's lips like a fragile breath of light, barely audible at first, as though even she was uncertain the palace deserved to hear it. Yet within seconds, the sound did not remain small. It spread through the Moonfall Palace hall in a way that no one expected, carrying a purity that seemed older than the stone walls surrounding them. Conversations that had been whispering moments before began to fade without command, as if the very air was choosing silence over noise. Emily stood still at the center of the hall, her posture tense but steady, eyes half lowered as she focused on the hymn she had only ever heard in passing during training. But something inside her voice was changing, something she did not understand. It was no longer just melody. It felt like resonance, like the memory of something the world had forgotten, but suddenly remembered through her. Around her, nobles exchanged uneasy glances as the temperature of the room seemed to shift, not in heat or cold, but in presence, as if unseen pressure was moving through the space between them. The chandeliers above trembled faintly, their crystals catching the sound and scattering it into shimmering fragments of light. At the far end of the hall, King Adrian Blackthorne finally moved. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in posture, as if his attention had been pulled by something invisible but undeniable. His silver gaze fixed on Emily with a focus that had not been there before, no longer detached observation, but something sharper, something alert. The nobles closest to him felt at first the sudden change in his presence, like a tightening of the air itself. Emily continued singing, unaware that her voice was no longer simply being heard, but felt. The Luna hymn, an ancient melody tied to forgotten rites of bond and recognition, carried through her in a way that defied expectation. Each note seemed to awaken reactions in those who heard it, subtle at first, then undeniable. A noblewoman pressed a hand to her chest, as if trying to steady her breath. A young alpha lowered his gaze, unsettled by emotions he could not name. And still Emily sang, her voice growing clearer, stronger, no longer trembling with hesitation. It was as though the hymn itself was lifting her, shaping her into something she had never been allowed to believe she could become. Then the shift reached the throne. King Adrian Blackthorne rose to his feet. The movement was not loud, not dramatic, but it commanded instant stillness across the entire hall. Every conversation ended. Every breath seemed to pause. His eyes remained locked on Emily, but now there was something different in them, something that contradicted his earlier indifference. It was recognition, sharp and involuntary, as though some ancient instinct had been struck awake within him. The sound of her voice pressed against him in ways no battlefield ever had, not as force, but as certainty. For the first time in years, the King of Moonfall did not feel in control of his own reaction. And as Emily reached the rising passage of the Luna hymn, her voice echoing through the silent palace like a forgotten truth returning home, Adrian Blackthorne stood completely still, as if the world itself had narrowed to the single impossible sound coming from the girl everyone else had chosen to ignore. As Emily Carter's voice continued to rise through the Moonfall Palace Hall, the atmosphere inside the grand chamber shifted in ways no one could immediately explain, as if the world itself had begun to lose its balance between silence and sound. The Luna hymn, once considered nothing more than a ceremonial melody, was no longer just music flowing through air, but something that seemed to carry weight, presence, and an almost physical pressure that pressed gently against the chest of everyone listening. Emily remained unaware of what she was becoming in that moment. To her, it was still only singing, still only a fragile attempt to obey an order she had no power to refuse. Yet the palace did not respond to her as it had before. Every step of her voice seemed to awaken something deeper within the structure itself, as if the ancient stone remembered a language it had not heard in generations. King Adrian Blackthorne stood motionless at the center of the elevated platform, his silver gaze locked on her with a focus that no longer resembled observation but confrontation. It was not hostility, nor was it kindness. It was recognition that had no explanation, a reaction that came from somewhere beneath reason, somewhere tied to instinct and something older than law. The nobles around him began to notice the change in him first. His presence, once controlled and contained, had shifted subtly, like a still lake disturbed by a force beneath its surface. Even those closest to the throne felt it, a tightening in the air, a sense that the king who had ruled without visible reaction for years was now reacting to something none of them could see. Emily's voice reached the second verse of the Luna hymn, and at that moment, the sound deepened, no longer simply echoing through the hall, but resonating within it. Crystal fixtures trembled faintly overhead, catching the vibration and scattering it into fractured light that danced across the marble floor. Several guests instinctively stepped back, their expressions uncertain, as though their own bodies were responding before their minds could understand why. Emily's breath grew steadier as she continued, though she still had no awareness of the transformation unfolding around her. What she felt was only focus, a quiet determination to finish what she had been forced to begin. Yet within her voice there was now something undeniable, a clarity that did not belong to training or practice, but to something far more intrinsic, as if the hymn itself had chosen her as its vessel. King Adrian's hand slowly tightened at his side, a restrained movement that revealed more than any declaration could. His eyes did not leave her, and for the first time since the beginning of the ceremony, his expression shifted from unreadable to intensely present. It was as though something within him had been struck awake by her voice, something that did not follow the rules of court or crown. The hall remained completely silent now, every noble, every guard, every observer suspended in the same unexplainable tension. Emily reached the final rising passage of the hymn, her voice no longer fragile but luminous, carrying through the hall with a resonance that felt almost like memory returning to life. And as the last notes expanded into the air, King Adrian Blackthorne took a single step forward, breaking the stillness of the throne platform, his gaze still fixed on the girl who had not been meant to matter, but whose voice had now made it impossible for the entire kingdom to look away. The final note of the Luna hymn did not fade so much as dissolve into the silence it had created, leaving the entire Moonfall Palace hall suspended in a stillness so complete it felt almost unreal, as if time itself had paused to acknowledge what had just occurred. Emily Carter stood at the center of that silence, her chest rising and falling with quiet breaths, unaware that the sound she had just released had altered the atmosphere of the entire gathering in ways no one in the room had ever experienced before. For a brief moment, she simply remained there, steadying herself, as though waiting for the inevitable return of judgment or dismissal, the familiar weight of being seen and then ignored. But nothing came. No laughter, no whispers, no shifting of indifference. Instead, there was only stillness, heavy and absolute. Then, slowly, the stillness began to change. From the elevated platform, King Adrian Blackthorne did not return to his throne. He remained standing, his posture no longer composed in the way a ruler trained by discipline would maintain, but subtly altered, as if something within him had disrupted the certainty of his control. His silver gaze remained locked on Emily, and now there was no question of distance or detachment within it. It was focus, intense and unbroken, as though the entire hall had narrowed into a single point of recognition. Around him, the nobles began to feel it more clearly. The air was different now, not heavier, not lighter, but charged in a way that made conversation impossible to resume. Even those who had once smiled at Emily's humiliation now found themselves unable to speak, their expressions shifting from amusement to uncertainty, then to something closer to unease. Emily finally lowered her hands, the final echo of her voice fading completely, and she lifted her eyes for the first time since beginning the hymn. That was when she saw him. King Adrian had stepped forward again, closer now to the edge of the platform, as though some invisible force had drawn him across the space that separated ruler from subject. His expression was no longer neutral. It carried a tension that seemed restrained rather than revealed, as if he were holding back a reaction that defied every expectation placed upon him. For a man known across the kingdom for his absolute composure, this moment of hesitation was more striking than any declaration could have been. Emily's breath caught slightly, though she did not understand why. She had not expected attention. She had expected nothing. Yet the weight of his gaze made her feel seen in a way that was unfamiliar, not as an inconvenience or a mistake, but as something that could not be dismissed. The silence in the hall grew deeper, if such a thing was possible, until even the smallest movement of fabric or breath seemed too loud to exist. Then, without warning, a faint shimmer of light passed through the crystals above, reacting subtly to the lingering resonance of her voice, casting fractured reflections across the marble floor between them. King Adrian's hand moved, slightly, as if he had intended to speak or step forward again, but stopped before completing the motion. The hesitation lasted only a second, yet it carried the weight of something far greater than ceremony. Emily did not move. She did not bow. She did not retreat. She simply stood beneath the fading light, unaware that the entire Moonfall Palace had shifted around her in a way that could never be reversed, and that the silence she had left behind was no longer empty, but filled with the beginning of something no one in that hall had been prepared to recognize. The silence inside Moonfall Palace did not break after King Adrian Blackthorne's hesitation. Instead, it deepened, becoming something almost sacred, as if the entire hall understood that whatever had just occurred could not be undone by simple reaction or ceremony. Emily Carter remained at the center of that stillness, her hands now lowered fully at her sides, her breathing steadying as the last echoes of her voice disappeared into the vast chamber. She did not know what to expect next, only that the weight of every gaze in the room had changed. It no longer felt like dismissal. It felt like uncertainty, as though the world around her had been forced to reconsider something it had already decided upon. From the elevated platform, King Adrian finally moved again, but this time his movement was deliberate, measured, and unmistakably different from the controlled stillness he had maintained throughout the entire evening. He took one step forward, then another, descending slightly from the position that had separated him from everyone else in the hall. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt what was unfolding. Emily lifted her eyes and saw him approaching, and for the first time since entering the palace, she felt something she could not immediately name. It was not fear, and it was not relief. It was awareness, sharp and undeniable, that she was no longer invisible. Adrian stopped a short distance from her, close enough that the space between them felt charged with something neither of them acknowledged aloud. His expression remained controlled, but the intensity in his gaze carried a complexity that contrasted sharply with the indifference he had shown earlier. It was as if he were seeing her not for the first time, but in a way that challenged everything he thought he already understood. Around them, the nobles remained frozen in place, their attention fully captured by the exchange unfolding at the center of the hall. Some exchanged subtle glances, trying to interpret what they were witnessing, but no explanation offered itself. Emily did not lower her gaze this time. She held it steady, though she did not know why she was able to do so in the presence of someone whose presence had silenced an entire kingdom countless times before. The air between them felt different now, not oppressive, but charged with an unfamiliar tension, like the moment before a storm reveals its direction. King Adrian spoke at last, his voice low and controlled, yet carrying a weight that immediately commanded absolute silence across the hall. The words were not loud, but they did not need to be. Every person in the room heard them clearly. Emily did not respond immediately. Her mind was still processing the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden reversal of attention, and the realization that she was no longer simply part of the background of this night. Adrian's gaze did not waver. For the first time since the ceremony began, the Alpha King of Moonfall appeared fully focused on one person alone. Emily Carter, who only moments ago had been dismissed as insignificant, now stood at the center of a silence so complete that even the palace itself seemed to be listening. And in that silence, something irreversible had begun to take shape, though neither of them yet understood its name. King Adrian Blackthorn's voice finally broke through the silence inside Moonfall Palace, low and controlled, yet carrying a resonance that made every corner of the vast hall feel smaller, as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen. "Come forward," he said, not as a command thrown into the room, but as a directed certainty aimed only at Emily Carter. The words did not echo like an order meant for a crowd. They landed with precision, as though the rest of the world no longer existed in his awareness. Emily felt her breath catch, not because of fear, but because of the unexpected clarity in being addressed so directly by someone who had not acknowledged her existence moments before. Around her, the nobles shifted subtly, confusion spreading in controlled expressions, as if each of them were trying to reconcile what they were witnessing with what they believed was possible. Emily took a small step forward, then another, moving carefully across the polished marble floor that reflected fractured light from the chandeliers above. Every step felt heavier than the last, not from resistance, but from awareness that the entire hall was watching her now in a way it never had before. King Adrian did not move from his position, yet the distance between them felt reduced with every step she took, as if the space itself was responding to something unseen. When she finally stopped within a few feet of him, the silence deepened again. His gaze remained locked on her, unwavering, and for the first time, Emily noticed something beneath his controlled expression. It was not simple curiosity. It was recognition that seemed to conflict with his own understanding of what he was seeing. "Sing it again," he said quietly, the request not carrying the tone of repetition, but of confirmation. Emily hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly at her sides. She did not understand what he meant, nor why the atmosphere around them felt so different from moments ago. Yet something in his voice made refusal feel unnecessary, as though the request was not about performance, but about truth. She took a slow breath, then allowed the first note of the Luna hymn to return, softer this time, less ceremonial, more personal, as if she were no longer performing for a hall, but answering something only she could hear. The reaction was immediate, though subtle. King Adrian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his eyes narrowing slightly, as though confirming a theory he had not yet spoken aloud. Behind him, members of the court began to murmur, restrained but unsettled, sensing that something beyond ceremony was unfolding. Emily's voice remained steady, but she felt an unfamiliar sensation, building again in the space around her, like invisible threads connecting her to something larger than the room itself. The chandeliers above flickered faintly once more, and for a brief moment, even the air seemed to hold its breath. King Adrian raised his hand slightly, not to stop her, but as if to steady the world itself. And in that moment, it became clear that whatever was happening between them was no longer part of the Luna rite or the expectations of the court. It was something deeper, something that neither of them had been prepared to name, yet both were now unable to ignore. The moment Emily Carter's voice rose again inside Moonfall Palace, the atmosphere in the grand hall shifted once more, not in abrupt motion, but in a gradual unfolding that felt almost inevitable, as if the space itself had been waiting for her to continue. The second passage of the Luna hymn flowed from her with greater stability now, as though something within her had adjusted to the presence of the hall, or perhaps the hall had adjusted to her. King Adrian Blackthorne remained close, his presence no longer positioned at a distance of authority, but standing within the same reality as hers, only a few steps away, watching with a focus that had become increasingly difficult to define. It was no longer the gaze of a ruler observing a subject. It was something more immediate, more personal, though still restrained by the discipline that defined him. Emily did not fully understand what she was feeling. There was no sense of performance now, only continuation, as if the melody itself was guiding her forward rather than her choosing it consciously. Around them, the nobles of Moonfall Palace stood in suspended attention, their earlier confidence replaced entirely by uncertainty. Some of them appeared unsettled by their inability to look away, while others seemed almost unwilling to acknowledge what they were sensing. The sound of her voice had begun to alter perception itself. It did not simply fill the hall. It reorganized it. Adrian's expression tightened slightly, a subtle shift that only someone watching closely would have noticed. His eyes remained fixed on Emily, but there was now a trace of internal conflict behind his controlled demeanor, as if something within him was responding to the resonance of her voice in a way that bypassed logic entirely. He took a slow breath, steady and deliberate, but even that measured control seemed slightly strained. Emily's voice continued to rise, reaching a point in the hymn where the melody carried emotional weight that felt almost physical in nature. The air around her seemed to respond, becoming lighter in some areas and denser in others, as though the room itself was adjusting to the frequency of sound she was producing. A faint shimmer passed through the crystals above once more, scattering soft light across the marble floor, but this time it lingered longer, refusing to fade immediately. Adrian finally spoke again, his voice quieter than before, but sharper in focus. The words were not directed to the hall, nor were they part of any formal declaration. They were aimed only at her. Emily's singing did not stop, but her awareness shifted slightly toward him, sensing the change in tone even without breaking the flow of the hymn. There was something in his presence now that suggested certainty had begun to dissolve, replaced by something far less predictable. The nobles, still frozen in place, exchanged subtle glances as the realization slowly spread that whatever was unfolding between the Alpha King and the unknown Omega was no longer a ceremonial moment. It had moved beyond tradition, beyond expectation, into something no one in the room had been prepared to categorize. Emily reached the final stretch of the passage, her voice steady but carrying an intensity she had not consciously intended. And as the sound expanded through the hall once more, King Adrian Blackthorne's gaze sharpened, not in reaction, but in recognition, as if the final pieces of a truth he had not yet spoken were beginning to fall into place directly in front of him. The final resonance of Emily Carter's voice did not fade in the way sound normally ends. Instead, it lingered inside Moonfall Palace like an invisible current still moving through stone and air, refusing to dissolve completely into silence. The Grand Hall remained still, but it was no longer the same kind of stillness that had existed before. It felt altered, charged with an aftermath that no one present could fully interpret. Emily stood at the center of it, her final note having already left her, yet her presence still seeming tied to the space she had filled with sound. For the first time, she did not immediately lower her gaze or step back. Something in the atmosphere held her in place, not as force, but as awareness, as if even she was now part of something unfolding beyond her understanding. King Adrian Blackthorn remained directly in front of her, closer than any sovereign should have stood to someone of her status, though no one in the hall dared question the distance anymore. His expression had changed again, becoming more focused, more internal, as if he were listening to something no one else could hear. The silence around them was no longer passive. It was expectant. Then it happened. A subtle shift passed through Adrian's posture, barely visible but undeniably present. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in recognition that carried weight far beyond the moment. The air between him and Emily seemed to tighten, as though an invisible thread had been pulled taut without warning. Emily noticed it only because she felt it, a faint pressure in the space around her chest, like the echo of her own voice returning in a form she could not see. Adrian's hand moved slightly at his side, not reaching, not stopping, but reacting, as though his body had registered something his authority had not yet allowed him to acknowledge. Behind him, the nobles of Moonfall Palace began to sense the shift more clearly now. Murmurs threatened to form, but never fully did, as if sound itself was being suppressed by the tension in the hall. Several of them instinctively stepped back, though they could not explain why. The chandeliers above, still and brilliant moments before, flickered again in faint response, scattering fractured reflections of light across the marble floor. Emily took a slow breath, her eyes still on Adrian, unaware of the deeper current unfolding beneath his controlled exterior. He was no longer observing her as a performer or a subject. Something in her voice had bypassed all layers of court expectation and reached something far more foundational within him. Adrian's gaze sharpened once more, and this time there was no hesitation in it. It was not confusion. It was confirmation forming in real time. Emily did not move, yet she felt as though the ground between them had shifted, as if the rules governing distance and rank had momentarily lost clarity. The hall itself seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for a response that had not yet been spoken aloud. And in that suspended moment, King Adrian Blackthorn understood something he could not yet name with words, but which had already begun to change the way he looked at the girl standing before him, as though her existence had just rewritten something fundamental within the silence of Moonfall Palace. The silence that followed the final exchange between Emily Carter and King Adrian Blackthorn inside Moonfall Palace was no longer the same silence that had existed before. It was heavier, more complete, as if the entire hall had accepted that something irreversible had just taken place without needing permission or explanation. Emily remained at the center of the grand chamber, her presence still framed by fading reflections of crystal light, her breathing steady but her awareness heightened, as though she could feel the attention of every person in the room pressing gently against the space around her. King Adrian stood before her, no longer distant, no longer elevated by symbolic distance or ceremonial separation. He had not returned to his throne. He did not look away. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on her with a clarity that had replaced all earlier restraint. The nobles of Moonfall Palace watched in complete silence, none of them daring to interrupt what had become something no longer governed by ritual. Then Adrian spoke again, but this time his voice carried no trace of ceremony or announcement. It was direct, low, and unmistakably personal in its direction. "What is your name?" The question should have been simple, yet in that moment it felt as though the entire hall had been waiting for it. Without realizing it, Emily hesitated only briefly before answering, her voice quieter now, no longer part of the hymn, but still carrying a resonance that lingered in the air around her. Adrian did not react immediately, but something in his expression shifted subtly as he processed her answer. It was not surprise in the ordinary sense. It was recognition deepening into certainty, though its source remained unspoken. Around them, the palace remained frozen in observation. No one moved forward. No one spoke. Even the sound of fabric shifting or breath being drawn seemed to vanish under the weight of what was unfolding. Emily finally broke her gaze for a moment, glancing briefly toward the hall beyond him, where countless eyes still remained fixed in silent anticipation. She did not understand why everything felt so different now, only that the world she had stepped into moments earlier no longer resembled the one she had lived in before. When she looked back at Adrian, she noticed something new in his expression. The control was still there, But beneath it, something had changed. It was no longer the detachment of a ruler observing a performance. It was the awareness of something that had reached him directly, bypassing every layer of authority and expectation. Adrian's voice softened slightly, though it did not lose its precision. Where did you learn that, Em? The question carried more weight than its words suggested, as though the answer mattered far beyond the walls of Moonfall Palace. Emily did not answer immediately, not because she did not know, but because she sensed that the response would not remain confined to her alone. The air between them felt charged again, not with performance, but with consequence. The nobles of the court shifted subtly once more, their attention now divided between disbelief and anticipation, as if they were witnessing the beginning of something none of them had been prepared to recognize. And in that final suspended moment, King Adrian Blackthorn continued to watch Emily Carter as if the answer she gave next would determine not only the remainder of the night, but something far greater that had already begun to unfold. Beneath the silence of Moonfall Palace,